Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. Welcome to How to Design a Monster for 5th edition, Dungeons and Dragons by Kobold Press. Woo!
Yay.
We are your hosts, Megan and Sarah. I am one of the editors at Kobold Press. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Madsen. I'm a freelance game designer and author, and I do a lot of writing for Kobold Press. So here I am.
Yay! So today we've got a lot of fun information for monster design. Part of the reason we were running this seminar is because we have the Tome of Beasts 3 Kickstarters live right now. And as part of that Kickstarter, backers are allowed to submit a monster for consideration. The monsters will go to a panel of judges. The judges will pick the top, I think what we've unlocked like 29 now. So I guess the top 29. And from there, those will be put into the book. So that's exciting. And for those of you who really want to either make the judges' lives very difficult because they have to narrow it down, we've got some good advice for you. I hope it's good advice. I think it's good advice. But
We'll see.
yes,
No, I'm sure it's
uh, yeah.
good.
But yeah, so I think we have a slideshow with some cool stuff.
We
We
should
can
in just a second.
And all the information that we're going to give here today, we're going to list them in a particular order, but y'all can do them in whatever order you want, right? Like it's just kind of like these are the key notes that you should be hitting when you're designing a monster and when you're thinking about your monster design. So yes, we've got our cover there for Tome of Beasts 3, our Bone Lord
I
and all
love
his
that thing.
skeletons.
It's
Oh
so good.
yes, yes. Don't you just want to throw them at some players?
Yes, yes, I do.
All right. So for our first slide, we have concepting. So as I said, we're going to do these in this order, but y'all don't have to. You can do whatever you want. I know some people like to start with the numbers, and some people like to start with the concept. So we're starting with concept here, and there's 3 key points to concepting, and that's going to be the creature's purpose, kind of their ecology, and then you have to research to kind of add some realness to the creature. But yeah, those are the 3 things we're going to be talking about. So our next slide is purpose, I believe. All right. So when you're coming up with a creature's purpose, you're going to want to ask yourself different questions. So if you're the GM, because so today we're going to be talking about monster design in general. So that could be if you're trying to come up with stuff for your homebrew game, or if you're trying to come up with a monster to, excuse me, submit for publication, or for the Tome of Beast 3 backer monster submission. All of this is applicable to all of those scenarios. So yeah, you'll want to ask yourself, do you need a particular creature that doesn't exist? You know, when you're prepping your game and you're like, I don't have this particular thing and I can't find it in any book anywhere. This is a thing I need, a niche that I need to fill. And I'm sorry, Sarah, any comments on any of this? I'm sorry. I'm just
Nope,
kind of
you're
running.
go run with it. I'll interject. Keep going.
Okay. But yeah, so do you have a particular need for this creature, right? I'm not saying that never ever make your own stuff, right? But you don't make things harder on yourself. As a GM, you've already got a lot you have to keep track of and worry about. So if a monster that fills the need fits, then go with that. But if it doesn't, then definitely make your own. Um, then you're going to look at, do you need a monster for a particular area of your world, right? Are you trying to uh, take your players to another area that's new to them, and maybe there's some local legend and you're like, oh, the local legend's got to be about this like crazy monster that the locals are terrified of or something, right? And that can be a way of really telling the story of an area, or um, of a people, right? Because myths and legends kind of define a lot of cultures. So creating something that could be part of one of those myths can really help expand on a part of your world. And then sometimes you just want to make a creature because you really, really, really want to stick it to your PCs, right? Like They just like murder everything, and you're like, no, this is gonna be the one. This is gonna be the one. Um, so that's another potential purpose. And then if you are basing something on folklore, or if you're inspired by a movie or something, because there's a lot of cool stuff in books and movies, you have to figure out what is its purpose in your world, right? Just because it fits into, like we have the hodag from Wisconsin folklore, right? Just because the hodag's cool and fits in Wisconsin folklore, how does that fit in your world's folklore, right? Um, any other comments on purpose, Sarah?
Just that whole folklore inspired thing. That's part of my favorite part of monster creation is not only figuring out, a cool monster with cool abilities that can be really scary, but how do you sort of weave it into the story of your setting? Uh, that's for me, that's when a monster design really starts to sing, right? When it's not just something that's sort of shoved into a setting because it like kind of looks cool, but where it makes sense and it feels organic and like it's part of your world. Um, yeah, that's my favorite
Heck yeah. That's what's great
bit.
about folklore, right? Like it's the stuff that is unexplained. So, ancient humans were like, "Hey, it's unexplained." So obviously it's this creature lurking in the darkness, right?
Yep.
So, all right. And then I think our next slide is ecology. Yeah. Look at that fragrant one. So regal on that mushroom.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about that guy. But yes, so the ecology, you're going to want to think about where your creature lives, right? So as Sarah was saying, the creature does need to fit in the world. So it needs to have some type of like, what does it do? Where does it live? What does it eat? What eats it if it doesn't eat other things? Is it solitary? Does it live in groups? All of these things are factors that change the fundamental nature of the creature, right? Like being a social creature versus being a solitary creature and all of that. And then it's also good to keep in mind how it interacts with sentient creatures, if at all. Because going back to things like folklore, if it is something that interacts with like local humans or local elves or whatever, how does it interact with them? Does it regularly hunt them? Is it a fun pet? Is it like those are scary? I'm never going near them. These are all things that also help you build like the myth or the story around the creature as well. Sarah?
No, yeah, that sounds great. No, no, just going back to so definitely part of when I design my monsters, a lot of it's not just what can it do, but like you said, how does it interact with the world around it? Um, and that will really inform you as far as the creature's behavior goes. If the players stumble upon it, or if it's being actively antagonistic, and if so, why. Really sort of helps you shape not just the monster, but the plot that can go with it. So.
And it can also shape how the creature responds to stimuli,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if the players suddenly stumble into its lair, what is it going to do?
Right. If they attack it, will it fight back? Will it flee? Will it beg them to quit?
Yep.
That sort of thing.
Yes. I think the next one we have is research. This is always the fun one, right?
Yes.
Everybody loves researching. We're nerds. We like it. So with research, this step is just you're gonna want to look at real world creatures that occupy similar habitats, or that have similar behaviors, or that might have similar adaptations, and think about how that helps your creature interact with your world, right? If you want a creature that can swim, you might not necessarily want to be like, but it inhabits mountaintops, right? I mean, there's lakes in mountains, right? But it's not, you don't want an ocean dwelling creature in the mountains. And that seems logical. But when we get to the part later when we're talking about stats and stuff, you want to make sure that everything kind of is cohesive and makes sense, right? That's the biggest part of research is it needs to kind of make sense. I mean, we're dealing in a fantasy world, but it still needs to have some sense of realness to it.
Absolutely. And this part can be so much fun. Just looking up creatures, because you mentioned looking up creatures that, occupy similar habitats, which is really important to sort of know, what what to sort of base it off of. But I also really love taking real world creatures that exist in one habitat and shunting them sideways into a different habitat and seeing how that would change or alter the creature, because we have some really wild creatures on this planet, y'all. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's some really bizarre things out there. And they're weird, especially like the deep sea and things like
Yeah.
that. They're crazy. And so taking some inspiration from that and taking a an animal that exists, in the deep sea or maybe like deep in the rainforest, and sort of shoving it into the desert. And what would you need to do to sort of alter that creature so that habitat made sense for them, yet how could they still maintain a similar niche but like in the new habitat? And that can bring a lot of inspiration. It's really fun.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much fun stuff in the real world, and it's great
Yes.
as an editor because I don't even have to look all of it up. All the designers, you guys are the ones that come over to me and it's like, "Hey, there's this weird creature. Did you know it existed? I did not know that existed. That is terrifying.
Yep.
What part of the world is that so I can avoid it?" And then you find out it's like this big in the real world. It's like, "Oh,
Right.
okay. All right, well that's fine then."
Yeah. But it's really fun to make them really big. Or even if it's really big, make it really small. And then how is that even scarier, when you have something
Right.
that's suddenly way smaller than it should be? Um, and then you have a swarm of them. It's great.
Oh, now I'm just thinking like a swarm of tiny elephants.
See, there you go. Exactly.
All right, and then our next slide. Now we're gonna get into designing things. Also, that is such a fun pig. So,
Yes.
yep. Some of the art we have, it's great. It's wonderful. All right, so that was all the concepting, right? So when you're just kind of brainstorming about what kind of how it fits in your world, what kind of things it does as far as like lore related and interactions with things. Then designing is when you're going to get into, I guess the what the official term is crunch, the mathematical type stuff. And when you're doing that, you're going to follow a similar pattern. You need to find out its game role, so, what is its kind of purpose in the game? You're going to want to make sure that the lore and the mechanics kind of define each other and work together. And then again, you're going to have your like reference and research phase where you have to look at other stuff. So, and
And
first,
definitely. Oh,
yes.
no, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I think the next slide may cover it, so keep going.
Okay, yes. So next slide.
Woohoo.
All right, game roll. Yes. So with this, you're going to want to think about what's the purpose of the creature as far as like its actual combat, right? So less about its purpose in the world and more about its purpose when it is interacting mechanically with other things. Is it intended to be a minion or a master, right? Is it intended to showcase a particular aspect of your setting? Maybe your world has like a magical wasteland or something. How does this creature show that? This could be a creature that's lived there and been changed by it, right? And it's going to exhibit magical wasteland type powers, right? And then is the creature intended to foil a specific set of PC skills or features? So if you're making this specifically for your game and you have the players that are they can beat up anything, but when you start throwing magic damage at them, they're like, oh no. So then you need your magical wasteland creature to be like, all right, we got you this time. I'm making it sound very antagonistic. You should not be an antagonist, but
Well,
you should tell it.
yeah, another aspect of that too is creating a monster that can challenge your players, right? Because you don't want every combat to just be a walk in the park. That's boring. But it's also a lot of fun to like craft something that allows your players to sort of show off.
Yeah.
So if they particularly have, a specific weapon or, a specific combat maneuver that they very rarely get to use, throwing a monster at them that lets them sort of be in the spotlight or get to utilize those rarely seen, skills on their sheet, can be a lot of fun, and your players would probably really appreciate it. Even if it's terrifying, it can be terrifying and heroic at the same time. So,
Yes. Well, and there's always that one or two thing that the players will hold on to, right? Like, I have this magical
mhm.
spoon. I've had it since level 1. I'm gonna use it one of these days. And, then they come across the Jello ooze, right? And it's like, "This is my time to shine." Like, players love those moments, and that's what people are going to remember
Yeah.
when they're done playing, right? They're not gonna remember that, "Oh, hey, we hit another bag of hit points." They're gonna remember that unique thing where the one time they got to use their magic spoon.
Yep, especially if you deal out loot via like random loot table rolls, because some DMs, you'll put specific things in specific places, or an adventurer has, an item that you hadn't really thought about having to use down the road. Like if your player has a sort of dragon slaying and they never run into dragons, like that's kind of a letdown. That's no fun. So
Right?
give them dragons to slay. So yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that would be very, very big much of a letdown if I was playing and I'm like, "I've got this sword of dragon slay," and it's like, "Well, this is an underwater campaign where you're fighting
Hmm.
jellyfish, I'm sorry."
Hmm. Yep.
Yep. Alright, and our next slide. Let's see. Yes, lore and mechanics define each other. So one of my favorite aspects of fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons is they kind of went backwards, I guess, towards second edition. Because in second edition, the monster manual had your little piece of art and the little stat block, and then the whole bottom half of the page was the description of the creature, their what was it, habitat, society, and ecology.
Hmm.
Right, this whole big block just about the creature. And in second edition, there was a cool block about the creature, but their actual stats were just like, okay, it's numbers. What I like about fifth edition is that a lot of times you can read the stat blocks and immediately know the creature's lore. And then you can read the creature's lore and immediately know what kind of stats it should have. And that's a really fun aspect of fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons that I really, really like. So when you're trying to create something that does fit within that scope, that range of things that they're doing, you're going to want to look at your lore and what can you pull from it, right, into mechanics. So is the creature native to a particular terrain? How is that going to affect it? Does that mean that it has camouflage in that particular terrain, so it's good at hiding in it? Or does that mean that, hey, I'm really good in mountains, so that means maybe I take less bludgeoning damage because I have to deal with avalanches all the time and getting hit by them, kind of thing. And if it's a predator or prey, how do its traits and actions reflect that? Right? Like a predator is going to be good at maybe like it's going to have some stealth or maybe have some type of like pounce or ambush type feature. And what do we got? Oh, then what other unique features of the creature's lore would make the most sense as a game mechanic, right? So you've got some description of it doing something in particular in the lore or something that maybe even the locals fear it for. How can you bring that into your game mechanics? And then you can also kind of reverse this too, right? Like you're like, I really want this creature to do this really cool thing, but how would that change its ecology, right? How does that change its place in the world? You got to make sure that if you do make those kind of changes, and as we said earlier, you can start anywhere in this process when you're creating your creature. So maybe your creature concept starts off with I need a creature that does this really cool thing, and then you can build from there, right? So the cool thing, how does that even work, right? Like what kind of things would it eat using that, or what would eat it because it has this feature? And
Yep.
Sarah,
Sounds good.
fair enough.
Nothing to add.
Okay. Yeah, but yeah, keep that in mind, right? It helps add that sense of realness, right? When
Mhm.
you've got mechanics that really tell you the story of the creature. And I think that's the Dorek. It's got a face on an octopus.
Yeah.
Like, why would you? That is terrifying.
Yeah, that's pretty awful.
All right, and then our next one is our research phase. Our next slide, sorry. Yep. Look at the dinosaur. Right. I mean, we're focusing on referencing and researching, not dinosaurs. Yes.
Mhm.
And this is going to be the part where this is the hardest part, right? Figuring out what the numbers are. So now you've got your idea of what you want it to do. You know that it's going to have advantage in stealth, or you know that it's going to have athletics and that it grabs things, right? So you're like, okay, I've got like a tentacle and it can grab and all that. But then what are the numbers? And that's always the hardest part. And the easiest thing to do is going back to researching and referencing, right? You're going to look up creatures that are similar to it. So instead of being what other creatures live in swamps, you then have to look, all right, what other creatures are around CR4 or 5 or whatever your target CR is? And what game mechanics can you pull from other creatures, right? Like you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? Like pack tactics is pack tactics, right? You can just grab that text and be like, all right, this creature has pack tactics. The same thing with some of the camouflage or like water breathing or something. You really don't need to reinvent it. Just grab that, pull it, kind of like Frankenstein a monster out of existing stuff. That sounds, is Frankenstein even a verb? I don't know if I can
It is now.
call. Am I even an editor? I just turned Frankenstein into a verb, but
Yep.
um, but yeah, and then also, if you're going to submit this for publication, then you definitely want to make sure that your game mechanics match the 5e rules language, right? So if you are picking up pack tactics, make sure that you aren't just putting pack tactics. It does good with its buddies. Like there's specific text that is pack tactics.
Yeah. I can't emphasize enough, like what Megan said, like don't make things harder on yourself. If there is a creature that already has something that your creature does, that's okay. And they can use that, and you don't have to sit there and like beat yourself up figuring out, what should the saving throw be, and how should I word this. You can just literally just pull it from something else. If you're doing something for publication, you don't necessarily just want to like kit bash two monsters together, but that can be a starting point where you take something from this monster and something from this monster and mush together, and then, flesh it out from there and add additional elements and new lore and everything else. And that can be a really interesting jumping off point. Like, well, what if, a displacer beast, but also a dinosaur, and then mush those together and then go from there. And it can lead to some really interesting places, but definitely don't make things harder for yourself, for sure.
Lizard-like displacer beast. That sounds interesting.
There you go.
I like it. And then also, as far as mechanics go, remember that 5th edition does have degrees of success and failure. So if you do have a cool idea, like hey, I like this poison and I want this poison to have a really bad effect if they if they rolled a nat 1 on their saving throw. And keep in mind, 5th edition does have rules for that, right? I think the easiest one to see is in the Drow. Because I believe the Drow, it does like standard poison damage or something, but then if you fail to save by 5 or more, you're unconscious. Right. So it shows that with degrees of failure or even success, if you succeed by 5 or more, maybe it invigorates you and you're immune to unconsciousness for the next hour or something. Right. You can do things like that with your creatures to further either mitigate how powerful they are or to further show some aspect of them. Right. Like if it's a spider and it puts its victims to sleep, but you're like, I really don't want the bite to just automatically make all my players unconscious. And then they're going to get upset because then the spider just gets to eat them while they're asleep. Nobody wants to do that. Players are going to sit and complain. But if you do something like degrees of success or failure, you have a higher chance of half the party is going to make it. The other half's asleep. And now they got to figure out what to do because there's this giant spider coming at them and half your party is down. So yeah, make sure to use that kind of stuff as well, kind of utilize that. And I think we're ready for our next slide. All right, testing. That's the Perry. That's some fun art. So yeah, testing. It's always good to test. We at Kobold Press really love our playtesters. Our playtesters are amazing. Hearts to all of them. They put in a lot of work to make sure that we're able to get the creatures as balanced as we can get them. And you can do the same thing for your own creatures, right? Definitely first start off with a personal test. Just kind of run the numbers, in a controlled environment, maybe with some pre-made characters or something, and kind of run the creature against them and just see how that goes. And then you can also do the group test of, hey, actually throw it at your players. See what they think. Maybe they're even willing to do it 2 or 3 times while you tweak it and murder all of them. Murder characters, not players. We don't murder players. And then the final check, um, this kind of comes from there's one of our a gentleman that used to design for us named Sean Merwin, an amazing individual. He had the three F's of monster design. Is it fun? Is it flavorful? And does it effing work? Well, we like to keep our conversation a little more PG, so we're just going to say, does it function? And that's kind of your last like gut check, right? When you're going through the creature, is this fun? Is there some cool flavor that other like if it is something that's for publication, are other people going to look at it and be like, yeah, I really want to put this in my world, or I can think of like 10 different places I'd put it. And then function is making sure that the numbers work, right? You don't want something to be like it's a CR0, but it hits every round for 50 damage. You know, we got to make sure that there's some sense of balance there. But Sarah?
No, yeah. I mean, definitely, aside from balance, I think those final F checks are definitely not more important than balance because balance is important. But you can create a really mechanically interesting monster, but if it's not satisfying those Fs, it's not going to be as engaging or as memorable as you want it to be. So, for sure.
Yes, and especially if it's for your like a homebrew game, it's your table. The players are never going to see the stat block, so
Hmm.
it doesn't matter how cool the stat block looks. You know, they're going to remember, you know, that it was able to bounce around the battlefield or that it was able to come up behind them. You know, that's the kind of stuff that they're going to remember. So make sure that that is included. And I believe is that our last? Oh no, we have
Yay.
one more slide. Yes. So
Yes.
I have the absolute pleasure of working with this wonderful designer here. Sarah created the ice worm for Tome of Beast 3. So, yes, this is sneak peek art. All of you get to see it for the first time ever. Woo!
Yay.
But, Sarah, you want to walk through your process of how you created the ice worm?
Yeah, so for the ice worm, I was trying to come up with monsters for the Tome of Beast 3. And I think the Arctic was probably one of the areas that we needed to flesh out a little more. So I kind of thought about, what sort of thing you would find in the Arctic that isn't like a polar bear. Um, and I know based off of various, videos on the internet that there are lots of things that live sort of down in the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic, even if it's freezing cold down there. There are still, weird worm creatures and bacteria and like microbes and things that live down there. They're usually much, much smaller. But I thought about, what if I took something that was able to survive at that sort of frigid temperature and like made it bigger? And they seem like they always have like really weird mouth things, right, going on, like especially worms like lamprey and things like that. They're just ugh. So, just make it bigger and have it be able to live in both the water but also in the Arctic, the ice itself. Um, and then thinking about okay, well, what does it survive on? How does it hunt if it lives in the ice itself? So it made sense to me that, it would have something like blind sight or tremor sense, even a heat sensitivity, where if there's something nearby that's radiating body heat, it knows, oh, okay, that's food. I can go eat that, right? Um, so I sort of took all those concepts and put them together and kind of figured out where I wanted my challenge rating to be, roughly, what sort of challenge rating niche that um, it would hit. And I think I decided what challenge rating did yeah, okay, it's one. So it's not a difficult foe, but it can be a tricky, unexpected foe, right? So if your people, your PCs are adventuring in the Arctic, they're probably watching for polar bears. They're probably watching for wolves. They may be watching the sky for birds of prey, but something that can come up through the ice beneath them would be a little bit unexpected and interesting. Um, so I you work out how strong would something like this be. Obviously it's not going to be super duper intelligent, all of the crunchy bits and everything else. But then, you know, so it can sense heat, but also, the idea that maybe doesn't necessarily like being around it, so it's a little bit vulnerable to that as well. Um, Sort of all came together and created this lovely, lovely worm thing. um, Testing wise, like Megan said, just I mostly ran it on my own, just because of the time crunch I was under, where I just sort of threw it against a couple of um, pre-made PCs of appropriate level, um, and it was pretty fun. And I hope none of my players are watching so that I can run it against them and they don't expect things coming up from under the ice at them. So yeah.
Well, and the art's great on this too, because that gives you an additional idea of, sure, it could come up at them, when they're resting and they're all sleeping on the ice in their sleeping bags, but it could also be something like, hey, you guys see some frozen adventurers, you're gonna go search the body for loot, and then you got this gigantic, well, not gigantic, I mean, it's big for a worm,
Yeah. For a worm, it's big. And
yeah,
it
coming
likes
up
to
at
sort
you.
of, yeah, it likes to kill and then burrow into the soft insides and just sort of eat as it feels like it. So definitely, you finding a body of something that's dead and it looks mostly untouched, and then this thing just erupts out of like this squishy frozen intestine. It's fun.
Yeah, never traveling in the Arctic, at least not in D&D worlds.
Yeah, nope.
Yeah, you're right. Like most worms, especially like at the really tiny level, have like that like little, what is it? I
Yeah,
don't know, saw mouth, whatever they have.
I'm sure there's probably an official name for like the little round mouth with all the teeth around it, and it like eats little circles out of things. Like
Yeah,
I don't know off the top of my head what it's called, but
it's terrifying either way.
yeah,
And I believe that one is our last slide,
yes,
right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yes. All right. So we have a Q&A now for people that have any questions. We do have a handful of questions to start with because we allowed people to, or we encouraged people to ask questions ahead of time. So for right now, if you do have any questions, make sure that you put question in capital right in front of your question, so it makes it easier for the people watching chat to see your question. And keep in mind, we are happy to answer questions related to monster design, but if you have any questions specific to how to submit your monster for Tome of Beast 3 and stuff like that, those guidelines will be posted on the 24th of February as an update on that Kickstarter. So that's all. We're not going to answer questions specifically related to like those kind of deadlines and word count and all that. Like that's some of that's already been posted, and then the rest of it, as far as when you submit, like which email address you send it to, all that kind of stuff, that will be posted later. But yes, so questions to start with that we had ahead of time was one person was asking how to make lair actions and regional effects that create fun encounters. So thoughts on this?
Oh boy. I think that goes kind of back to what you were talking about with considering where your creature falls in the ecology of an area. A lot of times you can really figure out, how a lair action should work based off of, you know, where do they live? Do they live in a cave? Are they haunting a mansion? Do they have a house, up in the trees? All of those things will begin to inform what sort of lair actions you should have. And I definitely suggest, looking at other layer actions that already exist, both in monsters that are similar to the one you're making and that aren't, because you may find something that, oh, this one does fire damage, but you maybe have an ice monster, but you can just sort of tweak it to make it work for you. Um, and I definitely think that the right layer actions can be a lot of fun and really up the interest and challenge of your combat situation. Um, even just basic ones, your players aren't always necessarily expecting layer actions. So something simple like, the ground shakes and they all have to make saving throws or they fall over, can add some flair to combat. So
Well, and stuff like that, like you said, with the ground shaking and everything, they might not even know that they've entered something's lair.
right.
And
Yep.
then that happens, they're like, "Whoa, what is happening?" Right?
Yep.
Mechanically, I think if you're trying to make layer actions that would make an encounter, I guess, more fun for everybody, you're going to want to think about layer actions that cause some type of a small effect, right? Like Sarah was saying with the knocking them down, something that kind of changes the ground, like things that cause difficult terrain, or something that can block or disrupt line of sight, right? So instead of, because that's what a layer would be for a creature, right? It is reaching out to its home and telling its home, protect me, because these bozos decided to show up and come after me for some reason in my home. So having something that, like, I think one of the dragons puts up like an ice wall or a vine wall or something, right, as a lair action, and it's something small. It doesn't have to be like a super 100-foot wide wall, but something small like that causes the players to rethink their strategy, right? They have to think about, okay, well, now I have to move, and now I can't just sit here and wail on the dragon. I have to deal with, now there's vines in my way or something.
Hmm. Hmm.
So just kind of change the environment that they're in, and that will force players to like think, do I want to deal with the environment right now, or do I want to just keep hitting this guy in the face? um, and then, oh, we have a question from chat that is related to our lair actions. Yes. All right. So, is a boss monster different from a villain, and if so, how?
Oh gosh, yeah, they can be. It's like not all squares are rectangles or you know what I'm trying to say. It's like they can be the same thing. Um, Villains can be your antagonists, but they don't always have to, you know, be the big boss monster. It may be that they summon the big boss monster, maybe they control the big boss monster. But I feel like a villain is something that's a little bit more plot oriented, where like the boss monster is the is the end of the combat, right? That's the biggest threat to you or to your players in the combat is the boss monster. Um, so if there's a wizard who has constructed this giant, awful flesh golem, the wizard is the villain, but the flesh golem may be, you know, the boss monster that you have to deal with at the end of the fight. So they can be the same thing, but they don't always necessarily have to be. So
That's very true. And I know we use the word monster a lot in all of this, but remember, NPCs are also monsters, right? So yeah, your villain could be some NPC that's like plotting in the background, and CR wise, the villain could be some CR2 local king or something, right? Like Sarah's saying, the king is the one. He's like, or even like a cult fanatic. I think they're what, CR2. So this cult fanatic is like summoning down like some great demon lord. But the villains often are going to be ones that are interacting with the players more, in that kind of, like Sarah was saying, with the antagonist type relationship with the players, not necessarily the main challenge at the end.
mhm.
But yep, excellent question. All right, then we have, oh yes, and layer actions. We forgot to mention that. So with layer actions and reactions, or not reactions, layer actions and regional effects, one thing that I have found very helpful personally as a DM is there is a video by Matt Colville called Action Oriented Monsters. So if you're doing homebrew and you're trying to create a creature specifically for a situation or an encounter, or specifically to counter your players, he's got some really good advice in that video of what kind of special, cool little legendary actions can you give them, what kind of cool layer actions can you give them to make them very unique for that situation. Um, it's not really something that you could use for publication necessarily, because the way he presents it, it's very personal to that creature. I think he uses like a goblin boss as an example of like, this particular goblin boss has been, amassing a goblin army for a while and has these specific legendary actions related to his accumulation of of everything. So again, if you're doing something like a villain, right, and you want that villain to be more dangerous, so even if it is a CR2 cult fanatic, if you're giving it legendary actions that allow it to bring the boss monster faster, right, if you're trying to stop a ritual or bring more minions in, there's other ways to make that kind of a very dynamic encounter that's very specific to the creature that you have created, the villain that you have created in your world. But that's a really great video if you're trying to make something fun and unique for your world. And then what else do I have? Let's see. The other questions. We had a handful of questions about balancing monsters. So that's always fun. Oh, we have another question. How would you judge the introduction of a totally new special ability in the CR calculation of a new creature? Oh, wow. That's a long question. All right. Oh, and it disappeared. Okay. New ability CR calculation. It depends on what the ability is doing, I think. Yep. Oh, there it goes. It's up on the screen again. That's cool. Yeah, I think it really depends on what it's doing, because CR is typically going to calculate things like how the creature is affecting the players, as far as is it damaging them, is it doing some type of special condition or effect to them. All of those can kind of increase or decrease the CR, right? Ultimately, if a monster is making the players not do something or causing damage to the players, those are all things that are going to calculate into the CR. But if it's some cool ability that just brings more of their lore in, but isn't necessarily um, combat effective, or not, I don't want to say combat effective, but things like the Chul has the ability to sense magic, right? Like that's not something that's going to calculate into its CR, but it can sense magic and it's going to find magical NPCs.
Yeah, that's
Sarah?
definitely more of a outside of combat ability that makes it more of an interesting foe. And yeah, I think definitely things like, if it can fly, if it stuns the player or the PCs when it hits them, if it has the ability to heal itself, those are all things that definitely go into, it would probably bump up the CR rating. But yeah, things like detect magic, or it doesn't require sleep. Like, okay, but that doesn't really affect combat very much. But it may affect the way that the players deal with it, because you have to strategize around certain abilities, but it's not a combat specific skill or ability. So, yep.
All right. And then, oh, wait, another one. How do you come up with the ability scores for the monster if you're creating a monster completely from scratch? For that, I would definitely suggest going back to that research reference phase, right? Look for other creatures that are similar, right? An ogre is not necessarily going to have a very high intelligence. I mean, it could, but your average ogre is going to have a high strength. So make sure that at least when you're putting all of your ability scores together, the highest one is strength. So think about the ratio that the ability scores are supposed to have with each other, and then find other creatures that have a similar CR and target that, right? Like, sure, 16 strength might be strong for a gnome, but it's not going to be strong for an ogre necessarily, right? So kind of like think about where those ratios are.
Yeah. And you could have something like a very, very smart ogre, type of ogre that's unusually intelligent, but how does that affect everything else, right? So it's going to probably change its actions. It's going to change what it does. Maybe it casts spells instead. And so it's going to definitely look at, compare it to regular ogres, so sort of see what sort of your baseline you're starting with, but then compare it to maybe other things that have abilities that are more in line with what it does, and see what they do and where their stats are at. Is definitely helpful.
Yep. And another question. All right. When a creature has an ability to summon another creature, how does that affect the XP equation? Wow, these are some deep questions. All right. Oh, that's a good question. I guess it depends. So if you're doing, well, if you're asking about XP, then you're talking about encounters that you're running. So I think it depends on how effective the creature is. right? So if you kind of want to gut check that, right? If it's a CR 20 creature summoning some CR1s, you probably don't want to add their XP into it because there's really no point. The CR1s aren't really going to be that big of a challenge to your level 20 players. So I think if you're just doing it from a perspective of how do you personally want to give XP, think about how effective those creatures were. Sarah?
I usually run with milestone leveling, so
I know, right?
I don't pay too much attention to no. No, yeah, I agree with that. Definitely consider, things like if it can summon additional creatures, it can complicate a combat, definitely. But yeah, sort of just looking at how much of an actual challenge it is comparatively. Um, yeah.
Yeah, because if it's summoning another creature, a lot of times that's going to take its action. So that's an action that could be spent attacking the players or dealing damage to the players or disabling the players in some way.
Hmm.
So a lot of times it actually could be less beneficial to the creature to summon something or to summon an ally, unless it's something like a lair action or a legendary action where it's kind of a free resource at that point. Typically in those situations when you're creating encounters, I would err more on the side of I'm going to create an encounter where they already have their minions with them rather than spending rounds of combat trying to bring more minions in. Because I don't think that's a very good use of, I guess, the action economy, right? Like
Hmm.
you have to keep in mind that it's one creature versus at least four players, and it's not a good use of its time, I guess. But I also don't want to sound like it has to be super optimal. But when you're thinking about designing your encounters, and if you want it to have minions with it, if it's supposed to have allies with it, then just have it start with allies with it.
Hmm.
Another question. What do you do to get the most out of testing?
Different combinations. Throw different combinations of classes and level and things like that at it. Don't assume that, all parties are the same, because you can have a party over here that gets TPK'd by a monster that this other party finds is just a walk in the park. So sort of mix it up and play around with, well, how would something with, no ranged weapon fighters, like if none of the party, you like, maybe you have a warlock, but like other than that you have nothing with very many ranged weapons, how would they deal with this flying creature versus how would this party over here that has, a ranger and, a ranged rogue and a wizard, how they deal with it, and kind of, play around with that mix a lot, I think will give you more bang for your buck for sure.
And that does remind me with the balance conversation. There are some creatures that, or there's some party makeups that will make certain creatures feel like they are either much higher than their CR or much lower than their CR, based purely on the party makeup. Like Sarah was saying, if they have no ranged attacks and there is a flying creature coming at them, especially if it has flyby, then it could be a CR1 creature beating up a level 10 party because they have no way to deal with it. So that CR1 creature feels like it's a much higher CR just purely because of that. So you have to think about the different parties. So if you're making stuff for your own game, for your own, I guess, situation, like for your own players, make sure that you take that into account. Like, don't always exploit their weaknesses, but you can. And I mean, in a nice way, I guess. Build creatures that are suited for the players that you have. If you're doing something for publications, then yeah, definitely, as Sarah said, try it with different party makeups because some parties are going to die from it, and some parties are going to completely stomp all over it. That's one thing that I've seen a lot from when we do play testing because I get to go through a lot of that feedback. And I'll have on the one hand, this one group is like, we love this creature, it was excellent, it was a great challenge. Then on the other hand, we'll have people that say, this completely killed my party within the first round. What are you guys doing over there at Kobold Press? So, and it's party makeups can be very different, but it's good to. I love the devious like there. It's great. But yeah, it's always good to test different scenarios. How do you make sure your created monsters aren't overpowered? Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were just saying as far as, make sure that you are testing in all kinds of different scenarios, right? If it's your home game, then you can kind of tweak it as you go. But if it's something for publication, then yeah, test it with different groups. Test it with an all caster group. Test it with an all melee group. Test it with a group that has no healer. Test it with a group that has two healers, right? Like, how does it fare and all of that?
And yeah, definitely compare it, like we said before, like going back to like looking at other things that are in similar CR ranges, like compare it to what's already out there, and how does it look overpowered? Like if you look at it, if you're are you like, oh no, this one thing can one shot like my entire party? Like it might be a little, yeah, for your game,
Yep.
but yeah, for yeah, comparing it to other things that already exist for sure.
Yep. Oh yeah, definitely. And with comparing it with other things that already exist, think about what has been a challenge for your players previously, and then what did they just stomp all over, and that can kind of give you your range to stay within. Next question: any tips on designing monsters with stages or monsters that escape if losing and then come back stronger? Ooh, stages. That's some video game stuff going on right there. All right.
I
That
definitely,
is.
yeah, no, go ahead.
I don't. It's a fun idea though, right? Because then the players have to kind of think about what's coming next.
Yeah, I definitely enjoy. I do in combat a lot craft specific, conditions where like if the monster falls beneath X amount of HP, it does Y, right? Like it runs or it lights its sword on fire, or I'm trying to think if I've ever built that into a stat block or not. I don't know if I have. I've definitely worked that into combat crafting, but um,
Yeah, and encounter design is a lot easier than doing it in the actual monster design
mhm,
itself. But for the stages thing, honestly, you could do something like going back to Matt Colville's action-oriented monsters, right? You could do stage type combat with that. Like maybe it starts combat with only one of those extra legendary actions, but then later on at combat, it gets like two or three of them that it can use every turn. And that can kind of help it feel like there's more stages. Or you could even have it drops to 0 hit points, but then it's kind of like a zombie. It makes a con save, and now it's back. And then you could, in that way, at least for your home encounters, you could then give it a whole new stat block, right? Say it's some humanoid that you're fighting and they've been studying to be a lich, and then your players kill them, but that was the last thing they needed to finish the spell or the ritual to become a lich. So then suddenly they rise up as a lich. Or maybe the players leave and they're like, ha, we got this guy. And then later on, he comes back as a lich and he's like, yeah, joke's on you. Thanks for helping me become a lich. You guys are great. So yeah, there's a lot of fun ways to do that. If the creature's meant to have elemental variation, how would you craft benefits when it's in its element? Fire cat, burning building, wind cat, high in the mountains. Um, I guess that's going to be similar to like the camouflage thing,
mhm,
right? Because with the camouflage trait, they get a bonus or advantage on dex if they're in their, or advantage on stealth if they're in their environment.
mhm. Yeah, I think maybe something like crafting crafting abilities that maybe don't necessarily have to be in its element, but its element can be nearby, like a fire cat, has the ability to control flame. And so even if it's not a burning house, if there's a bonfire nearby, it can utilize that. Um, yeah, yeah.
And you also could, in that situation too, it could be something similar to like the flesh golem, right? When the flesh golem takes lightning damage, it gets this extra benefit. So
Hmm.
something as simple as you don't realize it's a fire cat, they hit it with fire blast, and suddenly it has haste. And now it's hitting them like 5 times in a turn, and they're like, "What is happening? This cat is on my face clawing it." Um, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the environment, but it can still have that tell of the environment by something happening when it takes that damage. And then on the flip side, right, if the fire cat, they don't know it's a fire cat and they use Ray of Frost on it, suddenly it's all slow and it's sluggish and something's happening and everyone's like, what is happening to this cat right now, right? Um, and little things like that players are going to like too because it'll surprise them.
Hmm.
They're not going to expect it. Any abilities you consider off limits, like countering healing spells? Like personally or as an editor of Kobold Press? Like, um, Yeah, I can't say that they're off limits as far as Kobold Press goes because we already have a creature in Creature Codex that counters healing magic. So
Yeah, that's a monster design. I don't think anything's off limits, but definitely you have to decide at your table kind of what kind of table you're going to be or how ruthless that monster is going to be against your players. So, yeah, yeah. I like having the option on the table, but whether or not you use it is kind of up to you.
yeah, well, and you have to think too about like lines and veils at your table too, right? Like if there's something that somebody's not comfortable with, like you're talking about, countering healing spells, but there could be something like this creature always goes and eats kids, and there might be your table might be full of parents, right? Like you
Mhm.
don't necessarily want to have it do that, right? Like think about what your players are comfortable with before you start doing something like that. And then also, as far as I mean, if we're using countering healing magic as the example, um, if you know that your players don't have a healer and that their only healing is occasionally when they get a scroll, don't be that guy,
Yeah.
right? Like, don't be that person. So just think about what fits best for the players. Is
I
there?
think our last question.
Oh yes, last question. There's such a thing as having too many abilities on a monster. 5e doesn't really have a streamlined way to just putting an ability name and you can reference it in the index. Oh, okay. So yes, 5e has keywords without keywords. So like for people that are familiar with Magic the Gathering, like something like vigilance used to have vigilance and then the sentence describing what it was. Now it just says vigilance and it makes it to where you can put more things on the card. Um, yes, 5e doesn't have anything like that. And it is possible to have too many abilities. In my opinion, I think that's just me personally. And I think that's just because I like fifth edition having um, at least a few hundred words dedicated to the lore of the creature that tells you kind of like how to use it, why you would want to use this creature, what part does it have in your world. Um, and also you have to think about usability. So if you are writing for publication, like if it has 10 abilities, no GM's going to use more than 3 of them, right?
Mhm.
So, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I think that you have to sort of balance having flexibility within a creature, but also, like you said, usability. If I open a book to a creature, like the bigger the stat block is, the more intimidating it is to run as a DM, simply because I'm going to forget something or I'm not going to run something in optimal order, or, it can become overwhelming. So you need to sort of figure out, I would sort of narrow down like what the absolutely vital and interesting aspects of that character are and stick to those. I mean, it's fun to sort of throw everything onto one monster, but after a while it stops being.
Unique.
I don't, yeah, and I don't really like to use the word optimal because that sounds too like power gamey, but at the same time, like you don't want to throw a bunch of stuff on there that isn't necessarily going to get used and it's just taking up space, and making
Yep.
things more complicated for the other DMs that want to run it. If it's your own thing, sure, like go crazy. But if it's for publication, you probably need to sort of focus where you want your what you really want it to be.
Well, I think at that point it goes back to the lore and mechanics define each other, right? If
Mm-hmm.
it's got everything in the kitchen sink, how does that fit in your world? Where does that lore fit? So even if it has a lore stat block or a lore block with its stats, what is it doing with all those abilities? Like why does it need all of those abilities? It will feel like it's everything in the kitchen sink rather
Mm-hmm.
than this creature that has this cool feature that it uses.
Yep.
But I think that was the last question.
Yeah, I think we're at 8 o'clock, so
Yes, I think the other
we have
resources
to
we
move
wanted
up.
to tell people about were for those that are trying to make fun encounters in your own world. You want to keep things like fresh and innovative. Definitely check out a book called "The Monsters Know What They're Doing." And apparently we are about $100 away from hitting 650 in the Tome of These 3 Kickstarter. So that's cool.
Woo!
But yeah, so check out that. So if you're trying to add more flavor to your own personal homebrew games and you want to have more fun strategies and everything like that with the creatures, check out The Monsters Know What They're Doing. If you're trying to find new mechanical things to add to your creatures to make them more exciting at the table, definitely do check out Matt Colville's Action Oriented Monsters. And then if you're looking, you want to have kind of a stat breakdown for the people that are just really, really big math nerds. On the Kobold Press website, we have something called the Howling Tower. There is a monster stats series of articles by Steve Winter. He's the genius behind Scarlet Citadel. And he goes through and breaks down like the raw math of the monster manual and of monster design in general. And that's really, really good if you really want to see the math. And then if you just want good advice for monster design in general, not necessarily specific to 5th edition, check out the Kobold Guide to Monsters. It's got a lot of good articles in there that are just, things like how to reskin a monster, or how to take inspiration from pop culture and stuff. A lot of really great articles in there.
Yep.
And did I miss anything, Sarah?
No, I guess just check out, if you haven't already, check out the Tome of Beasts 3 Kickstarter. We have like a gazillion monsters, over 400, I think, plus, a whole ton of backer monsters that are going to be added. So that's really exciting.
Yes.
More things to terrorize your players with. Always fun.
Some of them can be allies, not all of them terrorize.
True. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching. This has been excellent. I am Megan Markle, one of the editors at Kobold Press, and
Sarah Madsen, freelance designer.
Thank you all.
And other places.
Yes. But thank you, everybody.
Bye.